The sharp cry of a security guard echoed through the polished marble floors of the law firm's lobby, piercing the otherwise serene atmosphere. "Get away from her. She might bite." The words hung in the air like a threat, one that couldn't be ignored. At the center of the commotion was Lily, a 6-year-old girl with wide, frantic eyes, clutching her knees to her chest as she rocked back and forth on the cold floor. Her blonde hair hung loosely around her face, hiding the fear that was written all over it. Her body trembled with the intensity of the storm brewing inside her, a storm that no one in the room knew how to calm. 5 suited executives stood around her, frozen in indecision. They murmured among themselves, exchanging glances, but no one moved forward. A team of professionals, paid handsomely to manage high-stakes cases and complicated contracts, yet completely paralyzed when faced with the simple task of comforting a child in distress. In the midst of the chaos, Antonio Rodriguez, a janitor, quietly entered the lobby, his mop in hand. He wasn't supposed to be there, not for this. But something in the scene caught his attention. He stopped. For a brief moment, everything went still. He saw what others missed, the quiet panic in Lily's eyes, the way her hands shook, how the world around her seemed to be closing in. Antonio, with years of experience as a caregiver for his younger sister who was also on the autism spectrum, knew exactly what this moment was. Sensory overload. It wasn't just a tantrum, it was a crisis. Without hesitation, Antonio stepped forward, his voice calm and steady as he called out to the security guard, "I can help her." The security guard blocked his way, his arm raised in protest. "You're just a janitor. Stay out of this. We've got this handled." But Antonio's eyes locked onto Lily's. She saw him, really saw him, and for a second, there was a silent understanding between them, a recognition that transcended words. Ignoring the guard, Antonio went to his cleaning cart, grabbed a small towel, and began to fold it into a simple, colorful shape. He held it up, letting Lily's eyes follow the motion. Then, he did something unexpected. He gently blew into the towel, making the soft fabric flutter in the air like a butterfly. Lily's frantic movements slowed as her eyes followed the towel. For a moment, everything else faded away, the murmurs of the executives, the worried looks, the chaos. It was just the two of them, Antonio and Lily, sharing a brief but peaceful connection. But what happened next was unexpected. Julia Benson, Lily's mother, had been watching from above, standing in the mezzanine on the second floor. Her sharp eyes, accustomed to high-stakes negotiations and courtroom drama, now observed something entirely different. She watched as her daughter, usually lost in her own world during these episodes, began to calm down, her hands gently resting in her lap. Julia's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had no one else figured out what Antonio just did? He wasn't a specialist or a therapist, he was just the janitor. But there was something in his quiet, unassuming demeanor that spoke volumes. Something that no one else had been able to do for Lily, despite the best specialists and thousands of dollars spent. Julia stood frozen at the edge of the mezzanine, her eyes still glued to the scene below. Antonio had done something remarkable. Something that none of the highly paid therapists had managed to do for her daughter, Lily. He hadn't tried to talk over her, or force her to engage, or try to fix her. Instead, he'd simply connected. That moment, so simple, yet so profound, struck Julia deeply. A wave of frustration mixed with disbelief swept over her. She had spent years, thousands of dollars, and countless hours on specialists from across the country. Therapists with degrees from Ivy League schools, child psychologists, behavior analysts. Yet, her daughter still struggled, isolated in her own world, unable to break free from the invisible walls that surrounded her. And here was a janitor, a man who was supposed to be cleaning floors, calming her daughter in a matter of moments. It was a gut punch to everything Julia had come to believe. How could this happen? Was all her success in the courtroom, her battle to get to the top, meaningless in the face of something as simple as human connection? Julia couldn't shake the image of Antonio as he quietly blew into the towel, gently coaxing her daughter back to a place of calm. That night, after Lily had finally settled down, she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts spiraled. Why had I never seen this before? She had spent years trying to fix Lily, assuming the right therapist, the right method, the right amount of money would make everything better. But the truth was, no one had bothered to just understand Lily. The next day, Julia found herself calling the building's management office, asking about Antonio. She needed answers. She needed to understand who this man was, and why he had succeeded where the so-called experts had failed. "Can you send him to my office?" she asked, her voice measured but filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. The receptionist paused, no doubt startled by the request. Ma'am. I'm not sure he's the type of person you'd normally want to meet with. I mean, he's just. Send him to my office, Julia interrupted, trying to steady her own racing pulse. I'll be waiting. When Antonio walked into Julia's office later that afternoon, he did so with the same calm, unassuming demeanor he'd shown the day before. He wore his janitor's uniform, the blue shirt and khaki pants so familiar to him. His face, however, was unreadable. Antonio had worked around people like Julia for years, high-powered, confident, and quick to judge those they considered beneath them. But he didn't care. He had a job to do, and that was enough for him. "Thank you for seeing me," Julia said, motioning to the chair opposite her desk. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm not sure what happened yesterday, but I need to understand what you did. I've been to every top-tier therapist in this city, and none of them have been able to help Lily the way you did in 5 minutes. So, tell me, how?" Antonio looked at her, his eyes steady but kind. He had been waiting for this moment since he saw the hesitation in Julia's eyes the day before. He knew the value of his experience, even if the world hadn't recognized it. "It's not about a technique or a therapy, Mrs. Benson," Antonio began, his voice soft but confident. "It's about understanding. Lily doesn't need to be fixed or cured, she just needs to be seen for who she is. Most people try to get her to respond to their method, their schedule. But no one's tried to just sit with her and let her be." Julia's face faltered. She had heard similar things from countless specialists, but hearing it from him, someone who had no medical degree or credentials, cut deeper. She was used to fighting, arguing, and defending. But for the first time, she felt challenged in a way she wasn't prepared for. Julia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But you're just a janitor. How can you know more than the experts?" Antonio didn't flinch. "I'm more than what you think I am," he said calmly. "I've worked in this building for years, observing the world's most powerful people and listening to their conversations when they think no one is paying attention. But I also have real-life experience with my sister, who has autism. I didn't need a degree to understand her needs. I just needed to be there." Julia stared at him, her mind racing. The more Antonio spoke, the more she realized how little she understood about what Lily truly needed. She was too focused on finding a quick fix, a method that would work within the rigid systems of her world. But Lily didn't fit into those systems. She never had. "You say you've been watching the people in this building," Julia trailed off, a thought forming. "Tell me more about that." Antonio hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've watched people come and go. The lawyers, the CEOs, the executives who think their titles and their money give them the answers to everything. But I've also seen the way they struggle when no one's watching. They hide behind power, but inside, they're just as lost as anyone else." The conversation shifted. Julia, still wrestling with the weight of what Antonio had said, finally leaned back in her chair. "What would it take to get you to work with Lily?" she asked, her voice no longer demanding but more open, almost vulnerable. Antonio paused, his gaze thoughtful. He had seen this before, the moment when someone with power and money was willing to pay for something they couldn't find on their own. But he wasn't interested in that. He wasn't interested in being another tool for someone to control. "I'm not looking for a paycheck, Mrs. Benson. I'm not interested in being a part of your system," he said firmly. "But I will help your daughter if you're willing to learn." Julia blinked. Learn? Learn that the world isn't something you can just dominate. It's something you have to understand, not just for your daughter, but for yourself. Julia sat back, her mind swirling. Everything Antonio said made sense in a way that she hadn't considered before. But the deeper truth hit her like a wave. Lily didn't need someone to fix her. Lily needed to be seen for who she truly was. Julia had spent so many years trying to climb the ladder of success, believing that if she could just get to the top, everything would fall into place. But now she realized that true success, in her personal life, with Lily, wasn't about achieving more. It was about learning to accept and understand the people she loved. Her heart heavy but full of resolve, Julia stood up and extended her hand to Antonio. "You're right. I need to learn. I need your help." Antonio stood as well, shaking her hand firmly. "It's a journey, Mrs. Benson. But it's one I'm willing to take with you." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Julia had agreed to Antonio's terms. No rigid schedules, no expensive therapies, just time spent truly understanding Lily. But it was harder than she had anticipated. At first, Julia tried to help Antonio set up the sessions, eager to see a quick fix. She made sure Lily was available, kept her schedule clear, and put on her usual armor of ambition and control. But each time Antonio showed up, he simply smiled and told her, "This isn't about structure, Julia. It's about connection." It frustrated her. Lily, who usually struggled with the chaos of new routines, began to show small signs of change. Instead of retreating into her own world, she began to make eye contact with Antonio, something Julia had never seen her do with anyone other than herself. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but to Julia, it felt like a breakthrough. Antonio was patient. He wasn't rushing Lily to speak, to react, or to conform to the timeline that Julia had in her mind. Instead, he allowed her to move at her own pace, meeting her where she was. He brought a small collection of items, paintbrushes, soft clay, and an assortment of colorful paper, and slowly began introducing her to new ways of expressing herself. But the biggest shift came one afternoon when Antonio arrived to find Lily sitting on the floor, her fingers pressing gently into a piece of Play-Doh, her expression focused. Julia stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. For the first time, she realized Lily didn't need to be fixed. She needed to be heard. Despite the small victories, Julia couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of her mind. Was this really working? Was she truly helping her daughter, or was she just letting things happen with no clear plan? The conversations with Antonio, however, brought moments of clarity that Julia had never experienced in her years of therapy and medical appointments. One day, as they sat across from each other in the living room, Antonio leaned forward and spoke gently. "You've been trying to control everything for so long, Julia. But Lily's world isn't something you can just manage. You have to enter her world, not force her into yours." Julia took a deep breath. His words struck at the core of her fears. She had spent so much of her life controlling every aspect of her career, her family, and even her daughter's future. The idea that control wasn't the answer felt like a blow to her ego, but deep down, she knew he was right. The next day, Julia let go. She stopped forcing Lily to follow a strict routine. She allowed her to explore on her own terms, and for the first time, Julia began to see the beauty in Lily's world. As days passed, Julia began to notice small but meaningful changes in Lily's behavior. One evening, after a long day of painting, Lily walked up to Julia and, for the first time in years, said something to her. "Mommy, can we paint together?" Julia froze. Her heart swelled with emotion as she looked down at her daughter, who was reaching out to her in her own way. It wasn't a sentence that many would consider profound, but to Julia, it felt like a victory that no amount of money or success could ever match. But just as Julia started to feel the joy of this breakthrough, another twist hit her, this one darker. The company where Julia worked had begun noticing her absence from meetings and her change in focus. The partners at the firm were starting to question her dedication. Pressure mounted as they began talking about promotions, deals, and high-profile cases that Julia had always excelled at handling. She felt herself being pulled back into the world she had tried so hard to escape, the world of competition, expectation, and control. Her phone buzzed, pulling her away from the tender moment with Lily. It was a message from a colleague, "We need to talk. You've missed too many meetings. This isn't like you." The next morning, Julia walked into her office at the firm, her mind still reeling from the message. Her job was on the line. Julia was no stranger to pressure. She had thrived under stress before, but this time felt different. The balance between her personal life and career was fragile. Antonio's approach to Lily had opened her eyes, but now Julia realized that her old life, the one where she had always been in control, was trying to pull her back. She met with the partners, her heart racing as they sat in the conference room. "Julia, we need you back," one of them said, looking at her with barely concealed impatience. "This firm is on the verge of a major case. We need your expertise." Julia nodded, her mind clouded with doubt. What was more important? The work she had dedicated her life to or her daughter's future? The next step felt impossible. How could she continue this new journey with Lily while keeping her career intact? Later that evening, as Julia sat with Antonio after a session with Lily, she finally spoke the truth that had been building inside her. "I'm torn, Antonio. My career and my daughter, how do I balance it all? How do I know what's the right choice?" Antonio looked at her thoughtfully. "You don't have to choose between them. But you do have to change how you approach both. You can't keep chasing success the way you have. It's killing your spirit, and it's hurting your family." Julia felt the weight of his words. Antonio had given her the perspective she desperately needed. It wasn't about choosing one over the other, it was about adjusting how she viewed success. Success wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder anymore, it was understanding her daughter and being present in her life. The moment of reckoning came when Julia finally had to make a choice. The firm offered her the promotion, an offer that would set her career on fire. But as she sat at her desk, looking at the contract in front of her, she realized something. This was the same path that had led her here. It was the same life that had drained her, and the same system that had led her to neglect her daughter's needs. In the end, Julia made a decision that would change everything. She handed the contract back to her assistant with a simple note, "I'm stepping down." For the first time in years, she chose peace over power, family over fame, and understanding over control. Months later, Julia watched as Lily, now more expressive and confident, worked on a new painting. Antonio had helped her break down the walls that had once kept her isolated from the world. And for the first time, Julia felt like she was truly living, not just existing. She had found a new way of balancing her life, and the ripple effect had already begun. Her decision to put family first had created a shift in her world, one where she no longer needed to prove herself in the courtroom, but instead in the home. And Lily's progress was the reward. Julia's decision had far-reaching consequences, but not in the way she expected. The firm had not only respected her choice but had started offering flexible schedules to others. Her journey became an example to others that true success wasn't about titles or money, but about being present in the lives of those you love. Antonio, who had never sought fame, had unknowingly led the way in redefining success. He became a symbol of unconventional wisdom, a janitor who had taught the world what it meant to truly listen, to care, and to understand. And as Julia looked at Lily, painting quietly by her side, she knew that this was the life she had been meant to live all along. The decision Julia made to step down from her high-powered position at the firm rippled through every aspect of her life, and in ways she hadn't expected. At first, she thought there might be resistance from her colleagues, maybe even pity from some of her friends, but the reaction was far different. At the office, the initial shock was followed by a surprising amount of support. Many of her colleagues, especially the younger associates, started questioning their own paths. How many of them were running on autopilot, chasing promotions, accolades, and money, only to wake up one day realizing they had missed out on life's quieter moments? Julia had never thought of herself as a role model, especially not in the corporate world, but it turned out her decision was the beginning of a larger shift. Some of her colleagues even reached out to her, asking for advice on how to balance their careers with their personal lives. One by one, they began reassessing their own priorities. At home, the changes were even more noticeable. Lily, once a quiet observer of the world around her, was now more present than ever. The soft brushstrokes of paint on her canvas told a story, of joy, of freedom, and of connection. Julia had spent years pushing Lily to conform to society's expectations of behavior, but now she was learning to allow her daughter to shape her own path. Julia had more time to truly sit and listen. No longer consumed by emails or the relentless pressure of corporate deadlines, she could focus on the quiet moments, the small victories that often went unnoticed. There were still tough days, of course, days when Lily struggled to communicate or when Julia questioned if she was doing enough, but those moments were no longer overwhelming. They became opportunities to learn and grow together. One evening, as Julia and Lily sat side by side on the floor, working on an art project, Julia had an epiphany. She wasn't just helping Lily anymore. She was helping herself. She was learning what it truly meant to be present, not just as a mother, but as a human being. Antonio continued to guide Julia and Lily with unwavering patience. What started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a deep mentorship. Antonio wasn't just teaching Lily how to express herself, he was teaching Julia the importance of slowing down, of listening, of valuing human connection above all else. One afternoon, as Julia sat quietly with Antonio, she said, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've changed everything. You've changed me." Antonio smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who expected praise. "It's not me who's changed things, Julia. It's you. You made the choice. You were open to learning something new. But not everything was smooth sailing. Old habits die hard, and Julia soon found herself torn between her new life and the remnants of her old career. The partners at the firm weren't thrilled about her decision to step back, and a few of them made their disappointment known. One day, Julia received a call from her former boss, David, the managing partner, asking her to reconsider. "You've got a place here, Julia. Don't throw it all away for something as trivial as family time." David's voice came through the phone, dismissive. Julia felt her old instincts rise to the surface. Her competitive spirit flared, and for a moment, she considered going back, telling him she'd reconsidered her decision. After all, the firm had been her life for years, and the prestige that came with it was hard to ignore. But then she glanced at Lily, sitting quietly on the couch, her paintbrush in hand, and everything clicked. She wasn't the same person anymore. With a deep breath, Julia calmly replied, "I've made my decision, David. I'm choosing to be here, with my family. This is the life I'm living now. It's not a choice I'll regret." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then David sighed. "Well, I suppose you know what's best for you." Julia hung up the phone, her heart still racing, but now, there was a sense of relief. The weight of the old life that had once defined her was now being lifted, piece by piece. The transformation wasn't just happening in Julia's life, it was happening in Lily's as well. The therapy sessions had long been discarded, and in their place, new forms of communication emerged. Painting, storytelling, and even simple physical touch became ways Lily could connect with the world around her. One afternoon, while painting together, Lily suddenly looked up at Julia and said the words that Julia had waited for. "I love you, Mommy." Julia's heart swelled with emotion. For years, she had tried to force communication from Lily, thinking that the right words, the right therapy, the right approach would bring it out. But here it was, Lily's love, expressed in her own way, at her own pace. As the months went by, Julia's decision to stay home, to be present, and to connect with her daughter, began to feel like the most rewarding choice she had ever made. She wasn't just seeing changes in Lily, she was experiencing change in herself. But one thing was clear, this was just the beginning. The shift wasn't only about choosing a slower life, it was about changing the way Julia viewed success and fulfillment. She began speaking at community events about her journey, encouraging other parents to follow their own paths to balance and authenticity. And to her surprise, the response was overwhelming. People wanted to hear what she had to say. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She wasn't just a mother. Julia had become a voice for those who wanted to make life choices based on meaning, not on external validation. Julia's story came full circle when she was invited back to the firm for a major project. She was no longer the ambitious lawyer clawing for the top. Instead, she had rediscovered her purpose and was ready to take on this challenge with a new perspective. In the meeting, Julia spoke with a quiet authority, one that didn't rely on force or competition, but on insight and compassion. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. When the project was completed successfully, she didn't celebrate with the same fervor she once had. Instead, she went home to Lily, to Antonio, to her new life, a life that was more than enough. As the years passed, Julia's life continued to evolve. She became a respected figure in the field of autism advocacy, using her own journey to help others who were struggling to find balance and understanding in their lives. Antonio, who had once been just the janitor, became an unexpected figure in the field of education and neurodiversity. His story, his patience, and his ability to truly see people for who they were, made him a sought-after consultant in schools and therapy programs. Together, Julia, Antonio, and Lily became a symbol of change in the way society viewed success, not as the number of awards on your wall, but as the impact you have on those around you. Julia sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset with Lily by her side. Antonio was visiting, as usual, bringing new materials for their art projects. Lily, now much older, had come a long way, and so had Julia. Lily looked up at her mother, her face radiant with joy, and said, "Mom, I'm happy." Julia smiled. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Julia realized that she had finally found the life she had always been searching for, not through money, status, or titles, but through love, patience, and the courage to step away from everything she thought she needed. Julia had found peace in her life, peace that she never thought was possible. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. It all started when she received an unexpected email one Thursday morning. It was from the National Autism Foundation, inviting her to speak at a conference on neurodiversity inclusion. The invitation felt like a recognition of her journey, but also a new challenge. The email read, "Dear Julia Benson, we are reaching out to invite you to speak at our annual conference on the topic of redefining success for children with autism. Your unique experience and your advocacy for a holistic, compassionate approach make you an ideal voice for our community. We would be honored if you could join us." Julia sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Speaking at such a prestigious event wasn't something she had planned. She had always focused on her personal journey with Lily, and her work had been mostly local, in small circles. But now, this was a chance to take her voice to a national stage. However, doubts crept in. She wasn't the expert they were used to. She had no formal degree in psychology, no certification in special education, she was simply a mother who had learned by living, by listening, by connecting. But then, Julia remembered how far she'd come, how much her life had changed since Antonio had walked into her world. She had embraced the idea that sometimes the most powerful voices come from those who live the experience rather than just study it. After a moment of silence, Julia typed a response. "I would be honored to speak. Thank you for the opportunity." The day of the conference arrived, and Julia stood backstage, her hands slightly trembling as she adjusted the microphone. The crowd was massive, more than she had ever imagined. Speakers had flown in from all over the country, from prestigious institutions and major organizations. And here she was, a former corporate lawyer turned advocate, about to share her story with hundreds of professionals, families, and parents. Her heart pounded in her chest. What was she doing here? But then, she thought of Lily, of all the small victories they had shared together. She thought of Antonio, who had taught her that the real change happened not in classrooms or offices, but in the quiet moments of understanding. With a deep breath, Julia walked onto the stage. The applause was louder than she expected, but Julia barely noticed. She stepped up to the podium, smiled, and began. "Good morning, everyone," she started, her voice surprisingly steady. "I stand before you not as an expert or a professional, but as a mother, someone who has learned through years of love, trial, and error what it truly means to be present for a child with autism." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room went silent. "I spent many years thinking that my success would come from being the best at fixing things, fixing my career, fixing my family, and yes, even fixing my daughter. I thought that if I could just get the best therapists, the best schools, the best professionals, I could fix it all. But what I learned was this: success isn't about fixing anyone. It's about learning to see the value in the people you love just as they are." Julia continued, sharing her journey, the breakthroughs, the setbacks, and how Antonio had opened her eyes to a new way of living, a new way of understanding. Her words, spoken from the heart, resonated with the crowd. "There's a saying," Julia concluded, "that the best way to predict the future is to create it. I believe that when we truly see our children, when we accept them as they are and learn to communicate with them on their terms, we create a future of possibilities, a future where they can succeed, and so can we." The applause was overwhelming. Julia stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. She had done it. Not just for herself, but for Lily, for Antonio, and for everyone who had ever felt invisible. As Julia exited the stage, she was met by several people who praised her speech. Parents, professionals, and educators approached her with tears in their eyes, telling her how much her words had impacted them. It felt surreal, like a validation of everything she had worked toward. But then came the unexpected twist. One of the last people to approach her was David, the managing partner from her old firm. Julia's stomach dropped. He had been there, sitting in the back of the room, and now he was standing in front of her. "I didn't expect to see you here, David," Julia said, surprised. David smiled, but there was a hint of tension in his eyes. "I'm here for work," he said quickly. "But I have to admit, I didn't expect this from you. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd leave all of that behind to become a speaker at an autism conference." Julia raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" David paused for a moment before speaking. "I just didn't think you had it in you," he said. "You always cared more about being the best lawyer, the top performer. But now, look at you, giving speeches about acceptance and change. It's surprising." Julia's heart pounded. She had never expected this. She had thought her journey was hers alone, not something that would ever reach back into her past. But here it was. David's words stung, not because she cared about his opinion, but because it revealed something Julia had been denying. She still hadn't fully let go of that old world. The world of competition, expectations, and corporate power. David's voice cut through her thoughts. "I'm not saying you shouldn't do this, Julia. But, don't you miss it? The world you left behind? The one where you had control?" Julia looked him in the eyes, a calmness washing over her. "David, I've learned more in the last year than I ever did in a courtroom. Success isn't about control. It's about letting go, of expectations, of judgments, and of trying to be someone I'm not." She smiled softly. "And no, I don't miss it. Not anymore." David stared at her, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded, as if seeing her in a new light. I guess I have to respect that. I don't fully understand it, but I respect it. As Julia made her way back home, she felt a sense of clarity. Speaking at the conference had been a turning point, a reminder that she didn't have to carry the weight of her past with her. She could build something new, not just for herself, but for her daughter and for the world that had always judged her. Later that night, as she sat at the dinner table with Lily, she realized how far they had both come. They weren't perfect. Life wasn't perfect. But they were finally living on their own terms, and that was enough. After the conference, Julia was overwhelmed by the response. Her speech had sparked something, people were listening. She had received emails, messages, and phone calls from parents, teachers, and advocates, all expressing gratitude for her honesty, for her courage to change the narrative about autism and success. But it wasn't just the parents who were responding. Schools, organizations, and even nonprofits started reaching out to her, asking if she would be willing to collaborate with them. They wanted her to speak at events, help shape their programs, and even participate in research projects aimed at better understanding neurodiverse children. One afternoon, as Julia sat in her office, sorting through her emails, a new one popped up. It was from Dr. Melanie Matthews, a leading expert in child psychology who had been following Julia's journey for months. The subject line simply read, "An opportunity for change." Intrigued, Julia clicked on the email. Dr. Matthews wanted to meet her in person to discuss the possibility of joining an advisory board for a new initiative aimed at creating inclusive education programs for children with autism. The project was backed by several top universities and educational foundations, and Dr. Matthews believed Julia's experience could bring something unique to the table. Julia felt a surge of excitement. This could be the next big step, a way to take everything she had learned and help shape the future for children like Lily. Without hesitation, she responded. "I would love to meet and discuss this further. Thank you for considering me." A week later, Julia sat across from Dr. Matthews in a bright, modern conference room in downtown Manhattan. The room was filled with people in suits, but the environment felt far different from the corporate meetings Julia had once attended. There was no pressure to perform, no deadlines hanging over their heads. Instead, the conversation flowed naturally, driven by a shared goal, to create an environment where children with autism could thrive without feeling like they had to fit into a mold that didn't work for them. "Julia," Dr. Matthews began, "what you've done with Lily, what you've taught the world through your journey, is exactly what we need in this initiative. It's not just about creating a program, it's about creating a culture of understanding. A culture that doesn't try to fix children, but embraces their differences." Julia felt a wave of gratitude. This wasn't just another corporate project, it was a chance to be part of something meaningful, something that would truly make a difference in how society viewed neurodiversity. "I'm honored," Julia said, her voice steady. "But I want to be clear, I'm not just a spokesperson. I've lived this. I want to be part of the real work, the day-to-day planning. I want to make sure we're getting it right for the kids." Dr. Matthews nodded, clearly impressed. "That's exactly what we need. A voice from the inside. Someone who has lived the struggle and found a path forward." And just like that, Julia was offered a seat at the table, an opportunity to shape the very thing she had spent years trying to find for her daughter, a future built on inclusion. As weeks passed, Julia became more involved with the project. The advisory board meetings were stimulating, filled with discussions on how to adapt schools and social structures to better support neurodiverse children. Julia brought her real-world insights, sharing stories from her journey with Lily and Antonio, offering practical solutions that could be implemented without the constraints of rigid systems. But as Julia dove deeper into this new world, she realized something. She wasn't just working on creating a better future for Lily, she was creating a better future for all children who had ever felt invisible. This was about changing the narrative, about teaching society that there was no normal way to be a child. Julia also connected with other parents, advocates, and organizations that were doing similar work. A community of like-minded individuals was growing, all striving to bring about positive change in their own ways. It was empowering, and Julia felt like she was part of something larger than herself. Through these connections, she was invited to speak at regional meetings and collaborate with other parents whose children were going through similar experiences. Together, they created a network of support, one that spread beyond the cities and into suburban and rural areas. Julia was no longer just a voice in a single conversation, she was part of a movement. But with all the positive momentum came a challenge Julia had not anticipated. One afternoon, while attending a meeting with several school administrators, Julia received a call from David, the managing partner of her old law firm. The tone in his voice was different than before, more serious, less dismissive. "Julia, I need to talk to you. It's about your involvement with the foundation," he began. "There's been some backlash. Some of the higher-ups at the firm aren't happy with your public association with the project. They're concerned it could damage the firm's reputation." Julia's stomach dropped. She had known there might be residual tension from her decision to leave the firm, but this was something new. They were trying to control her narrative again, only this time, it wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about her personal journey. David continued, "I'm not calling to judge. I just need to know where you stand. You're a respected figure in the legal world, Julia. This movement you're involved in, it's not the same thing. I'm worried about the optics." Julia took a deep breath, feeling her old instincts flare up. For a moment, she wanted to revert to her former self, the person who would have pushed back, defended her choices, and fought to prove her worth. But then, she thought about everything she had built in her new life. This was her truth, her purpose, and it wasn't about pleasing anyone else. "David," she said calmly, her voice unwavering, "I don't answer to you anymore. I don't answer to anyone but my family and the children I'm working to help. The work I'm doing is bigger than your firm. And it's bigger than my past." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, David spoke, his voice softer than before. "I didn't expect that. But I can't change your mind, can I?" "No," Julia replied simply. "You can't." She hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of expectations or the pull of her past life. She had chosen her own path, and no one, not even David, with all his power and influence, could take that away from her. Over the next few months, Julia's involvement in the Neurodiversity Project grew even more. She was invited to speak at conferences, partner with educational foundations, and even consult on legislation aimed at improving the lives of neurodiverse children. She became an advocate not just for Lily but for every child who had ever been overlooked or misunderstood. Her voice, once a whisper in the crowded halls of corporate power, had grown louder and stronger. It wasn't about being the most successful lawyer anymore, it was about being the most authentic version of herself. And in that authenticity, Julia discovered a new sense of purpose, one that she never could have imagined in the life she left behind. As she sat with Lily one evening, watching her daughter paint in the warm light of their living room, Julia realized that the journey she had started was only just beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Julia felt ready to walk it. Months had passed since Julia had severed ties with her old life. She had found peace in a new rhythm, a balance between advocacy, family, and self-discovery. Julia no longer had the pressure of climbing the corporate ladder, and she no longer lived for the approval of others. This freedom allowed her to focus on what truly mattered, changing lives. One evening, Julia received a call that would change the direction of her work once again. "Julia," the voice on the other end of the line said, "we've been following your work closely, and we think you could play a pivotal role in something bigger than what you've already done. We're launching a nationwide initiative to bring inclusive education to every school district, and we want you to be a key part of it." The initiative was backed by some of the largest educational foundations in the country, and it promised to be a game-changer. It would push for curriculum changes, teacher training, and support systems designed for children with autism, allowing them to thrive in mainstream classrooms, not just as passive observers, but as active participants. The weight of the moment hit Julia as she realized this wasn't just an opportunity to speak, it was a chance to reshape the future. The work she had started in her small community was about to go national. But she knew the stakes. This wasn't just a professional challenge, it was deeply personal. It was about Lily, about every child who had ever felt like they didn't belong, and about creating a world that understood. As Julia became more involved in the initiative, the scope of the challenge became clear. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The initiative would require buy-in from educators, policymakers, and parents across the country. It would require funding, resources, and, most challenging of all, cultural change. Julia quickly realized that changing educational systems wasn't as simple as pushing for new policies. The most difficult part would be convincing people that inclusion was not just a nice idea, but an essential human right. During one pivotal meeting with the board of the initiative, Julia stood up and said, "We can write all the policies we want, but we have to understand that true inclusion isn't just about adapting the classroom for a few kids. It's about changing the way everyone sees the world. It's about creating empathy, not just laws. If we can teach our kids that they are all valuable, no matter their abilities, we're setting them up for a future where they can truly succeed." Her words were met with silence, thoughtful, contemplative silence. But just as she thought she was losing them, one of the key partners, an influential policy advocate, stood up and said, "You're right. We're not just changing systems. We're changing minds." And from that moment forward, Julia's role evolved. She wasn't just a consultant anymore, she was the spokesperson for empathy, the voice for human connection in the conversation about educational reform. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the resistance. People who didn't understand the need for inclusion began to push back, questioning whether it was worth the cost, whether it would dilute the standard of education. The resistance wasn't just from people who opposed the initiative, it also came from within. Julia's team had disagreements about the scope of the project, the resources that would be necessary, and the approach they should take. The internal struggles were difficult. Julia had learned that not everyone saw the world the way she did, and getting everyone on the same page was a monumental task. One evening, as Julia sat in her office, reviewing documents, Antonio walked in. She hadn't seen him in a few days, as their paths had diverged with the increasing demands of the project. But when he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, he sat down without saying a word, just offering her the silent support she had grown to rely on. "I don't know if I can do this, Antonio," Julia said quietly. "I'm starting to lose sight of why I'm even doing this. The resistance is overwhelming, and the pressure is endless. I feel like we're pushing against something that's too big to change." Antonio leaned back, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this. Change is always hard. People don't like to let go of what they know, especially when it's uncomfortable. But you're not trying to convince the ones who don't want to change. You're doing this for the ones who need it. For the ones who haven't been heard." His words hit Julia like a wave. She had been focused on the resistance, the obstacles, and the opposition, but she hadn't stopped to think about the impact they were having on children like Lily. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm doing this for them. For the kids who will be in school tomorrow, and for the ones who will come after them. This isn't about me. It's about the future we want for them." The next year was one of the most difficult of Julia's life, but it was also the most rewarding. The initiative finally gained traction, and school districts began adopting the inclusive education model. It wasn't easy, there were battles over funding, curriculum changes, and pushback from people who didn't understand the need for inclusion. But step by step, things began to change. Julia found herself traveling across the country, working with teachers, parents, and children to build a framework of understanding. It was grueling, exhausting work, but it was also transformative. For every school that adopted the new model, Julia felt the weight of the fight ease just a little bit. Each victory, each child who found a voice, was worth all the struggles. At the end of that year, Julia was invited to give a closing keynote speech at a major national conference on inclusive education. Standing in front of a packed auditorium, she finally saw the vision she had fought for, a world where every child had a place, a world where acceptance was the norm. I'm here today, she began, not because I have all the answers. I'm here because we have the courage to ask the right questions. To ask what kind of world we want to build for our children. And to make sure that no child, no matter who they are, ever feels invisible again. The applause was overwhelming. But Julia didn't need validation from the crowd anymore. She had already found it in the faces of the children who were finally being seen for who they truly were. As Julia stood backstage, looking out over the audience, she saw Lily and Antonio sitting in the front row, their smiles warm and proud. Lily had grown so much, and while she still had her challenges, she now had the tools, and the world around her, to thrive. Julia knew there would always be more work to do. The path to inclusion was long, and the fight wasn't over. But she had come a long way, and so had the world around her. She had given it everything she had, and in return, the world had given her back something priceless, a future of hope, understanding, and possibility. Julia continued to work with schools and organizations, always pushing for greater inclusivity and understanding. She had built a life based on authenticity and human connection, a life that was no longer defined by titles or achievements, but by the impact she had on others. And as she watched Lily, now a young teenager, painting her future, Julia smiled, knowing they had both created something far more important than any career could ever give them. They had created a life filled with love, acceptance, and the courage to be seen. The journey was far from over, but Julia had finally found what she had been searching for all along, a place where she truly belonged.